This is Arthur and the Last Kings of the North. Unfortunately, it's slipped down. Caroline and I have been writing recently, as you know, with our new book about centre places around the British Isles. Out of a curiosity of coincidences along the spine of Albion, we decided to explore the middle places more because there was a lot of intrigue around them. And what is at the centre of Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, Ireland and England? And is there any connection between them? And we found some fascinating information, so much so that we decided to write the book. And in our quest to find an omphalos for all of the omphalos sites, in other words, the centre point of all of the British Isles and Ireland, we're drawn to this ancient kingdom of Rheged, which used to be a part of an Iron Age Brigantia. In fact, Rheged is derived from Brigantia, from Brigant, Bregit, Rheged. And basically, Brigantia means the realm of the goddess, bride, or Bridget. So Rheged, in his way, is alluding to the goddess in the land that was worshipped, not just in the north, but all over the British lands. So what we also discovered that within this kingdom of Rheged were an illustrious line of kings who held out against the Saxons and the Normans, more so than anywhere else in the British Isles. So that they had poems written about them, they were featured in ballads, their battles were famous, and I believe some of them were mixed in with Arthurian battles. And this talk is a little bit about some of the mystery around the centre kingdom. Also later on I'll tell you that there's a connection between this realm and the sacred isles of Britain. And I mean sacred islands like equivalent to an Avalon. So Glastonbury was the Avalon of the south, if you like, Iona, the Avalon of the north, and to the people in Northumberland, Lindisfarne was an Iona, so an Avalon. So there's a connection between those three sacred islands and this middle land. Because if you look at a map of the whole of Britain, Cumbria is the middle land, right in the middle. And it's a fascinating landscape. Has everybody here been to Cumbria? In this lifetime? Some in another lifetime, maybe. But Cumbria, for me, is the realm of the British, and a place where a lot of the old knowledge was kept and hidden away. And even today, there are pockets of Cumbria that have hidden knowledge, and we keep discovering things. And some of it went into our new book, The Power Centre. Some of it I'll reveal to you this afternoon. So we all know Arthur was connected with Glastonbury, Wales and Cornwall, but very few know that he was actually connected with the north of England. And so Arthur may well refer to the bear, a warrior, a protector goddess of Britain, but he's also associated with certain sites of power. So we're going to look at some of those. So when I was young and I first read the Triads, it's not something everybody does, read the Triads, but the Triads are the oldest histories of the British race. And it's written in triplicate, in threes. And the very first Triad says that the tribal thrones of Britain were in Wales, near St David's, in Cornwall, a place called Kellywig, and a place in the north called Penrith. So these were the tribal thrones, the chief prince of Arthur. Also in Triad 85, Arthur's three principal courts were Carlisle on Usk, Kellywig in Cornwall, and Penrith in the north. So interestingly, Kellywig we know as a place, probably, there's two sites in Cornwall that we reckon we pinned this great place of assembly. In Wales, it's one of two, either Carlisle on Usk or St David's, or probably both. But the tribal centre of the north has always been Penrith, which nobody seems to identify academically. But it sounds to me very much like Penrith. But there's very little at Penrith at first until you look into the area around Penrith, and there's some very interesting things indeed. If we look at a map of the three courts of Arthur, you see that Kellywig is in the centre of Cornwall, Wales on the coast because it was a great harbour for trade, but Penrith is in the middle of the Lake District, in the area called Rheged. So when the Saxons pushed back the Britons, these were the regions around about the 5th century AD. So these were the last realms of the British, Cornwall, Wales and Rheged. And Cornwall fell and Wales fell to the might of the Saxons and the Normans and became subservient to them. But in the north they held out far much longer than all the others, probably because of the terrain, and also because there were secret valleys where they could live in and feed enough people to survive there for years, right up into Norman times. But it's also a fascinating place associated with Arthur. And when we were actually sort of questing along the Bleanus line from Manchester to Carlisle, we discovered many Arthurian sites or places named after Arthur. Some of them were burial places of Arthur, sleeping places of Arthur, Arthur's court, and places where he would fight with giants, dragons, and green men, or green giants, shall I say. So this area between Carlisle and Penrith is particularly rich in Arthurian myths and legends. So I'm going to just run through some of those places in case none of you know. One thing that connected all these sites along with Arthur was Urien of Rheged. He seems to haunt the same areas that are supposedly Arthurian sites. And I think a lot of the plates were mixed up with Urien and Arthur. He had a bard just like Arthur called Taliesin. Taliesin wrote that he was a sovereign ruler supreme, a ruler all highest. And he was associated with the raven, which is interesting because in Welsh, raven is Bran. And Bran's associated with protector god of Britain. His head is supposed to be buried in the White Mound where the Tower of London is today. And all Bran sites tend to be places or associated with people who've protected the country. So ravens were associated with all these great northern kings, Urien, Owain, his son, and later kings of Rheged were also associated with the raven. Not that they carried ravens around with them, but I think the raven stood for these protector kings. They were protecting Britain. Now Urien has an interesting story which we'll sort of go in and out of as the talk goes on, because we're going to visit some of his sites. So Carlisle is a fascinating historical place. It's not much to look at today. It had its day, in fact, and a lot of the great buildings have been taken away. Even its cathedral has had its its chancel taken away. So it's more like a squat church now. But in medieval times, and long before, it was a great city. The Romans made it the capital of the north, along with York on the east. But so it had great walls in Roman times. It had baths. It had sort of a forum, temples. So when the Romans left and these buildings remained, they were taken over by these rebel gangs. And eventually, Urien of Rheged got all the tribes together to cleanse, if you like, the area of Rheged, and he became king or ruler of that kingdom, and his capital was Carlisle. So he'd taken over this great fortress built of stone, living like Arthur in Camelot, with his bard Taliesin. And he went on many adventures. Interestingly, Carlisle and Fontevraud, Poitiers and Winchester all have a connection with the Angevin line. And long after Urien, when Carlisle sort of collapsed from raids from the Scots and Saxons, Henry II rebuilt most of Carlisle, and with his queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, they presided over court there. They didn't stay that long in Carlisle, but as many of the kings did in them days, they went on a sort of a circular tour of their courts, and Carlisle was one of them. So they had a court at Winchester, a court at Carlisle. They were married at Poitiers, and they're buried at Fontevraud upon this main axis through Europe. So we almost called this line the Angevin line, because of their connections, on the bloodline connection with all the other places, which we go into in the Spine of Albion. But, you know, both our books are about connections and the collective consciousness, and this is what we are finding with these magical places. And it felt to me like Carlisle was once very important, but it's now a lost city. This book was written a few years ago by Stephen Matthews, and he discovered that during the reign of Henry II, lots of poetry and ballads were sung about these Rheged kings and King Arthur, and they became the romances. Eleanor of Aquitaine had sponsored Chrétien de Troyes before she married Henry II. Marie de France was often at court with Henry and Eleanor. And of course, Thomas Malory, long time after, also talked about Arthur and Carlisle. So most of those poets who were around Henry and Eleanor had written that Arthur's Camelot was Carlisle, not Carlisle in Wales or any other place. So historically, if you're going to look at documents, there's more documented evidence for Camelot being Carlisle than anywhere else in the UK. But nobody seems to know anything about Carlisle. And if you visit today, it's quite industrial roundabouts. But there's still fragments of that ancient mystical city when you explore it. We did a guided tour of Carlisle a couple of years ago, and we found some very interesting things indeed. So when they excavated the grounds of Carlisle Castle, they found wooden buildings underneath that dated from the 5th, 6th century. This is the period of Arthur and Urien. So some of the ballads may have been true that Arthur or Urien may have had their centre or capital at this place. And lots of documents were found as well by historical writers such as Marjorie Rowling, and another one I've forgotten, but a particular medieval charter dating from Henry I that records a piece of land near the cathedral known as Arthur's Burh or Arthur's Fort. Here you see that Carlisle Cathedral, how huge it was and what a big estate. It was originally founded by the Augustinians, and then it was rebuilt and rebuilt. After the Reformation, it continued for a while to be a mighty cathedral, and then they took away this part here. So now it's just a stump here in this part, and all these buildings have gone. But obviously it was a magnificent, worthy of a Camelot, if you like. What fascinated me was that part of that charter goes on to say that an ancient building called Arthur's Chamber, taken to be part of the mansion house of King Arthur, existed near St Cuthbert's Church. And St Cuthbert's Church stands just a short walk away from the cathedral. And it's quite an ugly building. It looks rather like some kind of Georgian frontage because it's been built and rebuilt many times because of the Scottish raids were burning this church down. But the first thing I notice about it is its orientation is towards the northeast, which is unusual for a church. We should be east-west. So it had a pagan orientation. And then when we did some research, we discovered that they discovered the footings of a Roman temple underneath. And for some reason, they'd continued its orientation. That's the Roman temple and not the English church. Also, interestingly, where they found the Roman temple was this part here. And this part here belongs to the clergy, and this part belongs to Carlisle Cathedral. So it's interesting that places of power seem to have been come into the hands of people of power. So Carlisle also has lots of dragons, not just stone dragons, but energy line dragons. And those of you who know our work on the spine of Albion will probably have read that the male current comes from a court in the Inglewood Forest through the main court in the city, through this area here, St Cuthbert's Church, through the part where the Roman temple was. And it's this area here where Arthur's burh stood. So we got some dowsers together on one of our trips, and we found some ancient walling near the tithe barn here. So we think that Arthur's burh was here. But this is the interesting thing about it. It's not Arthur's castle. I mean, if Arthur was supposed to be in Carlisle and that was his Camelot, this would have been his castle on this site where they found structures dated from his time. But if you look in through proper documents, you'll see that Urien lived in Carlisle at the time of Arthur. And that Arthur's court, as the Triad said, was in Penrith. So, and Penrith is about half a day's horse ride from Carlisle at that time. So maybe what was going on here is that if there was an Arthur, he came and stayed in Carlisle as his own mansion. We'll see. Interestingly enough, just outside of Carlisle, this solid gold ring was found in the marsh. And it dates from sort of Viking times. And there's a runic script around it, dating from that period. And it hasn't been properly deciphered. But they reckon it contains elements of some sort of charm. I always wondered if it says, one ring to rule them all. But it is a magnificent find. And Arthurian stuff seems to be magnetized to Carlisle. I'll show there's Grail symbolism, ancient stones, like you've never seen in the Carlisle area. I'll show you some of them, but there's a massive collection in Carlisle Museum of the most unusual stones you'll ever see. Some shaped like a serpent, penis-shaped stones, omphalus stones, pine-combed, a serpent wrapped around it. Omphalus stones that you see depicted in Delphi, Jerusalem, Babylon have been found in this Cumberland area, as if the ancients understood there was something central about this place, a place of power at the centre of all things. Just south of Carlisle is Inglewood Forest. And Inglewood Forest comes in is mentioned in many of the old romances and ballads of the Carlisle area. It's a place where Arthur is supposed to have gone on a hunt. Percival is supposed to set out on a quest for the Holy Grail from Carlisle into the Inglewood Forest. Owain is supposed to have met the giant in the forest. There's lots of stories around Inglewood Forest. There's still some of the forest left. But one of my favourite stories is the one of Owain who comes up against a great baron, and he goes with him to his castle of Hutton. And interesting enough, there's still a Hutton place here, and it's now a house called Hutton in the Forest. It's a fortified house. And local people are always saying that they think this is the castle associated with Gawain the Green Knight, so the castle of the Green Knight. And we were told there's some interesting stones associated with this place that prove it to be a very, very early building. In fact, we discovered it belonged to the foresters going back to at least times of King John and before. And we eventually found this carving round the back in the private area, and it depicts a green man coming out of a bough. This is the bough of a branch, and he's emerging from it like some kind of green man. But it's very, very old indeed. It's most certainly early Saxon or before. It could well be Romano-British. But because it's made of granite, it's very, very worn. And the other stones you can see are far more recent, but this one is very ancient indeed. And it stands above a holy well. Just down here is a holy well, which stands in the centre of the forest at this place said to be associated with the Green Knight. Lots of interesting symbolism. And also, just south of Inglewood Forest is what remains of an ancient tarn called Tarn Waddling. And this also features in the ballads and romances of Arthur, written by Crichton de Troyes and Marie de France, because there was many an adventure Arthur had around Tarn Waddling. So unfortunately today there's nothing left of Tarn Waddling. It's just a flat lands. It's been drained over the centuries. But you know, if you go and stand looking across this plain, read all the stories associated with this tarn, it's a mystical place. It's said to be where Guinevere had an experience in the evening where a ball of light, which we think is probably a ball of plasma, came floating along the lake. And as it got near to her, she could hear it crackling and seeing sparks from it just like plasma. But then her mother appeared to her in some kind of spirit vision and said that she must mend her ways. So just above Tarn Waddling is a place called Castle Hewings. And this is an early map showing the name Castle Hewings, and this is the Castle Hewen that features in the romances where a giant lived. And this giant was also went by the name of Ewan, or possibly Urien. Or Ewan is also said to be Urien's son, Owain. It's all very complicated. But basically these were questing knights who always had adventures, and they're always seeking some mystical object. So is there any evidence for this? Well, in the 18th century they did find the ruins of a castle here with 8 feet thick walls, so it was obviously a major site. But another place associated with Arthur and Urien, possibly more to do with Urien, is Yew Close at Crosby Ravensworth. The raven comes in again. Here is one of the largest British sites dating from the Iron Age, with huge circular foundations of circular buildings, square buildings and rectangular buildings, as if they are copying Roman, Celtic. And it's said to be Urien's palace. But when we look at Arthur's court in the Triads, it's definitely Penrith. Penrith is how it's pronounced in English. And anybody been to Penrith here? A couple of people. Penrith has got a lot of hidden history. And not just the Triads point to this place being a tribal centre, but other histories too. Apparently there was a great meeting at Penrith, just south of Penrith, where a treaty was signed, where all the tribes of Britain signed a peace treaty not to go to war with each other. And this was held by Aethelstan, the last of the great Saxon kings. And he was possibly the first overall king of England, or Britain, some say. And he met with all the tribes just south of Penrith. Now, why would he do that unless Penrith was somehow important, either geographically at the centre of roads, or maybe he knew that that was an ancient tribal throne of Arthur or Urien. So nobody seems to know where Arthur's court or where this chief tribal throne area was in Penrith. And it's interesting if when you drive into Penrith, you don't even see the castle because of the way the bypass goes through the town. But the castle is there, and it has mighty earthworks, huge ditches around it, which lots of the archaeologists say that it belongs to either a Roman fort or a British fort. So it has its history, and this lovely old print just shows you the energy of this castle, built of this great red sandstone. But this would have been the tribal centre of the Britons of the north. But today, you know, people just walk their dogs around it. It's free to go in. But there's something very magical and specific about this place because its geographical position overlooks where all these ancient roads meet. The A66 from the east, the Great North Road, the A6, which the M6 replaced, goes right past the castle. So it was a junction of major routes. A place worth visiting if any of you are heading up that way into Cumbria. Call in and just have a sense of the power of this place. It's forgotten and it's re-emerging. People want to know about these places again. In Penrith there's also this great circular churchyard around a medieval church and this grave, and it's said to be the largest of its type in the UK. It has 4 incredible hogback tombstones with 2 9-feet-high Viking crosses. And it's said to be, in legend, to be the grave of Urien's son, Owain. But there's a confusion here because there was many Owains and Uriens. And it may be that it was just the grave of many of the Rheged kings. So why aren't they buried at Carlisle, which is supposed to be the capital? Why Penrith, which is a smaller place, not as mighty or Roman as Carlisle? So I think there's something geographically important about Penrith that's been forgotten. It was the lost tribal centre of the north. And it has unusual things, and I'll carry on. Because the hogbacks itself show the great serpent fighting another serpent and a little man standing on the head, riding on the back of the serpent, just as we'd seen in Mayan temples. And on the top we see an amalgamation of the prehistoric spirals with the Celtic interlace, and then the Viking roof slabs. It's a fascinating monument, worthy of a visit. Just to the east of the Penrith Castle along the River Emont are these series of caves known as the Isis Parlis, which means the parlour of Isis. And these caves have been rumoured to have all kinds of activity going on over the centuries. They were the centre of a well cult, because a holy well existed at the front of the entrance just down here. It's said where giants lived. It's said to be the resting, not the resting place, but where Owain, the great knight, retired after a battle, which is a common theme in many of the Arthurian stories, or other stories where a great knight who fought in a battle often retired to caves as hermits afterwards. And this wonderful cave, which we managed to get permission to go and see, has got incredible recess inside, a semicircular recess, and we discovered it was also had a dragon line running through it, which turned out to be the Ellen dragon line from the spine of Albion. And there was a great spiral in front of this altar where there was a crossing of underground streams. So it's one of the most powerful places I've ever been to. And just in front of the cave, this area of land is almost like an island. There used to be a stream here. This here is a wonderful church. Used to be a medieval church. It's now 16th century. But it's dedicated to Saint Ninian. The earliest, he was a 4th century actually, Christian missionary. The earliest missionary in the north of England. And the church is dedicated to him. And also the caves which are here are associated with him. And the earthworks here were part of an ancient monastery that, according to the information board, was a Col D monastery. So one of the earliest Christian sites in England, rather like Glastonbury, a similar heritage to Glastonbury, existed just outside of Penrith, the tribal seat of the north. And also what we have at Penrith is Arthur's Round Table. Some of you know of Arthur's Round Table? One or two of you? I mean, we visited this site because it's part of the spine of Albion dragon currents, but there's a whole lost history in this place. Its name, although it's associated with Arthur, it's a Bronze Age site, dates from 2000 BC. It's a place of ceremony. It's known to be a place where games were held in ancient times, jousting tournaments. Legends say that Arthur came here and took part in the tournaments, and knights jousted for the hand of his daughter Gwyneth. Just in the car park here, there's a big stone, a stone planter, said to be one of the outline stones that stood at the entrance. And these two stones point towards the great beacon hill behind. And that alignment is due north to the pole star. And the name Arthur's Round Table may have something to do with the great bear, and the little bear that protects the north, the bear, the protector. But there's also an east-west alignment, because just here's Arthur's Round Table and here's Mayburgh Henge. And Mayburgh Henge is one of the most spectacular monuments I've ever seen. There used to be another henge here, so there were three henges, and another site up here. It was a very, very complex megalithic site. This is a Stuckery drawing, of course, you recognise the style. Him showing games and tournaments being held in the 18th century. And equidistant to the two henges is Broom Hall, once known as Windsor of the North, and that was built over a Roman tower. But Mayburgh Henge, difficult to capture Mayburgh Henge, it's such a huge monument. I had to use a panoramic camera just to get a sort of scale of this place. So if I show you where Caroline, there's Caroline there, can you see that dot? And that's a 9-foot tall standing stone left out of a 4-stone feature. So here was held the Treaty of Aymond, where Aethelstan brought together all the kings of the Celtic kingdoms together to sign a treaty of peace. And this is supposed to have shown Aethelstan shaking the hand of Constantine, the King of Scotland. This is found in a church just literally up the road from Arthur's Round Table. So here we see the three sites, Broom Hall, Arthur's Round Table, Mayburgh Henge. If we draw a line through the three sites from a holy well that stands in the middle of Broom Hall, it goes straight through this saddle of Blencathra and beyond through Skiddaw and Bathenswaite Lake. So Bathenswaite Lake is a very mystical place, as well as Skiddaw and also Blencathra, which experts these days have realised that many of the megalithic monuments around Cumbria or in that area all point towards it as if it's the holy mountain, the mother mountain of this central land. This is where, according to folklore, Arthur lies sleeping, like he lies sleeping at many other places, even Alderley Hedge. But it's also said that Urien may be buried here, or he's a son Owain, because St. Kentigern built many churches around this great central mountain. And St. Kentigern was supposed to be the son of Owain, so some say he was searching for his father. But Bathenswaite Lake, here's Skiddaw, which is shaped like a cup. So it's interesting, that line goes from the three henges through the twin-peaked mountain of Blencathra and then into the cup of Skiddaw. Skiddaw, if you look at Skiddaw like this, it just looks like a mountain. But if you go up and hover above it, it's shaped like a cup or a grail. For me, it is a grail mountain. It's made of a different stone than all the other mountains in Cumbria. How long have I got? 3 minutes. Okay. So Bathenswaite Lake is one of those places in Cumbria where all the psychic forces, geographical forces, history seems to come together. Many poets have been inspired and stayed there, including Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, who stayed at Mere House just over here. And he was inspired by the legends that Arthur's sword was found in this lake and that he retrieved it. And there's a memorial stone at the side of the lake it's called the Tennyson Memorial, that shows a sword with a hand coming out of the lake. And believe it or not, there was a sword found near the shore of Bathenswaite that dates from the time of the Iron Age. They're not sure of its date. It could be 1st, 2nd, or 2nd, 3rd century AD, or even BC. But it is a Celtic sword, and it's one of the finest ever made. In fact, one of the excavators said it was an Excalibur of some ancient Britain, not without wealth and art. It's a magnificent thing. But the burial place of Arthur, I mean, we always think that Arthur's buried here in Glastonbury, but in the north, he's known to be buried at Arthurette, which means Arthur's head. And this church you may go to and think, well, it's got to be a bit of a laugh, Arthur buried here, but there's something quite strong and powerful about this place because it's on a hill overlooking the Solway Firth. And when all that was flooded hundreds of years ago, it was like an island. And it's said that Arthur fought one of his last battles here. And strangely, there's a Grail that somebody's placed in the wall. This church has a lot of mystical things, including ancient crosses. We think that if Arthur was buried here, he'd be under this mound, which dates from the Iron Age, in the churchyard. And of course, at the back of the churchyard is this wonderful holy well, rather like the Chalice Well, which has flow forms coming down, but it's been neglected, so it's nothing like the Avalon of the south. But for me, I wanted to share with you what we've found in mystical Cumbria, because there's a lot more to tell. And where Urien is also buried at Lindisfarne, there's also a story to tell there. Because even the shape of Lindisfarne looks like a head with a crown, an eye and a mouth and a nose. And Urien's said to have been killed on the island, assassinated by one of his own, and buried between these two pyramids. Urien was one of the greatest and last of the British kings, but also one of the last kings was also buried at Dunmail Rise. And he's supposed to have had a crown, and that crown was thrown into a tarn nearby. And that tarn, there's a legend that soldiers every year go to this tarn, ghostly soldiers, take out the crown, go down to the tumulus on this old border of Cumberland and Westmoreland, and ask the king inside the tumulus if he wants his crown. And he always says, "Not yet, my soldiers, not yet." So he's like another sleeping warrior waiting. And crowns are interesting because, as Yuri had discovered, the 3 sacred islands of Britain are all connected with the story of the 3 crowns. And right at the centre is St Bees Head in Cumbria, which I discovered was an island. This is the Umphless of the British Isles. And within that Umphless, there's more bride sites than anywhere else in the whole of Europe. It is the Ring of Bride. It contains Penrith, Carlisle. It's the inner ring, the middle ring, of Andrew Collins's sort of discovery. But so in a way, the centre of the 3 crowns all have something very interesting in common with the sacred islands, because Bride features here in Glastonbury. She features very strong in Lindisfarne, believe it or not, with our research. Also Iona, as we know. But here, at the very, very centre, is a Ring of Bride. And we feel that perhaps there's something that we need to connect here energetically, because Bride is also the deity of the new age of Aquarius. So perhaps, this is something that may come to the fore, and future psychic quests may reveal something very interesting about the old lost kingdom of the north. Okay, thank you.